For armature making, we are going to need a few tools. Some of these are not needed, but some are, meaning you can get away without having all of these. They are all fairly easy to access items that you can get from almost any hardware store. The items that might be hard to get is armature wire, of course. You can often find armature wire at art or hobby stores, or perhaps you will need to order some from an online store. There are some items here that we are missing, and we'll cover those as we get to them throughout the video. More details for each item will also follow as we progress through the process of making the armature. First, we are going to attach the floor flange to the wooden board. It will be attached at the corner and will be a part of the external armature support that we are going to build. I prefer having an armature that is supported externally, as it does assist in leaving the ankles thin and makes the process of sculpting more flexible, as you'll see. Alternatively, you could attach the wire into the base directly, but this locks you into a pose very early, and that's not always a good thing. You want to be able to make changes as you work. If you can't get a floor flange, you can also drill a hole in the wooden base and simply glue the external armature wire support directly into this hole. Use epoxy glue. That's the best glue for this. We want the external support to enter into the sculpture at a 3/4 angle at the hips. There is no information to lose here, or the information is rather broad as compared to the sacrum, for example, where there is information to lose. The figure armature is going to be made up out of aluminum armature wire. The thickness of the wire is going to depend on the size of the sculpture that you are making. Today I'm making a sculpture at about 1/6 scale, which in my case means around 30 centimeters tall, and for this I'll use a wire that's square and about 3 to 4 millimeters thick. You could easily use a wire that's round if that's easier to get for you. Usually round wire is much easier to acquire, and it's going to work just as well. For a 1/6 scale figure or 30 centimeter tall sculpture, excluding the base for now, I'll cut about 80 centimeters of wire. This is certainly going to be overkill, but gives me more space at the bottom and at the top of my sculpture, which is something that I prefer. Slightly longer legs or slightly longer arms can be cut down when we decide on our final proportions during the sculpting stage. Once cut, I'll loop the wire, grab the middle of it, and twist the section that is going to become the inside of the torso. Be careful to not twist too large of a section, as we don't really need a twisted section that covers the entire length of the torso, just a section that is large enough to cover the majority of the torso. If you twist too much, the torso will have to be longer than it needs to be in 1/6 scale, and we will run out of wire for the legs, or we'll end up making a larger figure. Try to twist up a section for the torso that's about 5 to 7 centimeters long. This will give you some room at the top where the shoulders will be, which is always nice so you don't run into wire around the neck. And you'll see what I mean once the armature is ready for clay. The legs need a certain length in order to be proportional to the upper body. This was accounted for when we cut the wire, and now we are going to bend in the width of the hips. This is a rough guess at this moment, of course, but it's nice if it does what we need it to do, more or less. The length of the legs should be at least 15 centimeters from the bottom of the pelvis, also known as the crotch, to the bottom of the feet. For a figure that's 30 centimeters tall, we want to have the bottom of the pelvis sit at 15 centimeters from the ground, as this point tends to be more or less the middle of the body. I should say we want at least 15 centimeters long legs. Longer wire than that is no problem, as we can cut them shorter later or hide the wire inside the base. The loop will be cut at the top and the shoulders will then be bent in. They should be about as wide as the pelvis, perhaps just a touch more. The arms should reach about mid-thigh, but again, having longer wire now is perfectly fine, as we can cut it back later. The most important part to check at this stage is that the armature can support the scale figure we are after. This means the legs must be at least 15 centimeters long and the torso no longer than 7. When we measure the 15 down from the crotch to the bottom of the legs, we should also be able to measure the same 15 centimeters heading up and reach quite a bit above the top of the torso where our head armature will eventually go. Now we have a figure with legs, torso and arms, but not a head yet. Cut a piece of wire for the head. We'll use the same wire that we used for the rest of the figure. The wire should reach down into the torso quite a bit, as this will help it be secured in place. The wire should reach upwards so that it's at least 15 centimeters from the crotch to the top of this wire. And if it's longer, that's not a problem. We can bend it over or cut it back. Use a thinner wrapping wire to tightly wrap the armature piece, the head armature piece in place. Make sure that the connection is tight, as the last thing you want is a head that is flopping around all over the place. That's going to make it very difficult to work. The wrapping wire is just aluminum armature wire that's very thin, much thinner than the original wire that we used. If you can't find thin wrapping wire like this, you can always use the green floral wire that florists use to bind bouquets of flowers together. This is often available in most hardware stores and many supermarkets as well, or perhaps a garden store. Try not to use zinc wire or iron/steel wire, as these are live metals, which means that they will bounce back when you bend them. The reason we use aluminum is because it's dead metal and we can bend it without having to worry about it bouncing back on us. This makes it ideal for armature making. In addition, it's flexible of course and takes bending very well without becoming too much weaker. You can bend it a lot without it breaking. The entire figure should then be wrapped in this wrapping wire with the exception of the torso. The reason you want to wrap your limbs in wrapping wire is because square or round aluminum wire is going to have a very hard time holding on to the clay that we are going to apply. The clay will slide around on the armature, and this gets to be very annoying and very difficult to work with. Wrapping wire around the armature solves this problem and keeps the clay in place. The reason you don't need to wrap the torso is because the twisted wire inside the torso is going to be more than enough to hold on to the clay. No matter what clay you use or what kind of wire that you use, I always use plenty of wrapping wire. It helps the clay grab onto the armature. While it takes a few extra minutes to do, it's well worth the effort and the peace of mind that comes from doing it, knowing that your clay figure will not fall off the armature, that is. Next step is going to be to attach our figure armature to the external armature support. We'll use a small piece of plumber's piping as our vertical section. This is what is going to attach to our floor flange. Then we'll use a thicker aluminum armature wire for the horizontal section and the part that enters into the figure. The wire is around 1 centimeter thick, which provides adequate support for this figure of 30 centimeters. And if you were going larger, of course, you might want to use a thicker wire or perhaps even a plumber's piping entering into the figure. To bend such thick wire, we are going to be using leverage. If you had a bench vise, which I don't, you could use that as well. And if you don't have one, then just use some tools that will give you a bit of leverage. And you can bend this really thick wire into very short sections. Always use your brain, not your brawn. Especially if you don't have much brawn. The external wire is going to be attached to the plumber's piping using what is called a hose clamp. These provide excellent attachment without the need for glue or anything that is going to fail. You could also use zip ties, but I think for this connection, which we need to be really strong and have all the space in the world since it's not inside a sculpture, we can use a hose clamp. Remember that the figure is going to have this external support entering into the side of one buttock, and so it's best if this wire aims toward the middle of the board from one of the corners of the board. This way, once the figure is mounted, the front of the figure will be facing a flat side of the board and not a corner. This will help us out later when we are sculpting. Having the figure in the middle of the board is not necessary, strictly speaking, but somewhat nice in my opinion. A figure that is far forward on the board might more easily tip the board over, as long as the external armature support is far enough away from the internal armature so that you have room to work and sculpt as well as enough room for a mold later, you should be more than fine. A small scale figure like this is very unlikely to tip over anyways, but it's good to know.